You'd be hard-pressed to find a figure who's had a bigger impact on human history than Jesus Christ. I mean, for billions of people, his existence is just a given, a foundational fact that has shaped our world for 2,000 years. But what if it's not a fact at all? What if that core assumption is just wrong?
One of our sources asks this very question, and it really cuts right to the heart of what's at stake here. It's a question that makes you step back from centuries of art, music, and tradition and ask, what's the actual hard evidence for the man at the center of it all? So let's do that. Let's investigate.
Now, to be clear, for pretty much every mainstream historian and biblical scholar out there, the existence of Jesus isn't really up for debate. But for more than a century now, there's been this challenger theory, this idea that Jesus Christ wasn't a historical person, but a myth.
So let's lay out the two sides of the ring. In one corner, you have historicity. This is the consensus view. A real man named Jesus lived, he taught, and his followers started what became Christianity. Simple enough. In the other corner, you have mythicism. This view says, nope, there was no man. The character of Jesus is a mythological creation, kind of like a composite of other ancient myths, who was only later written into a historical backdrop. Okay, so this is where it gets a little spicy. Mythicists love to bring up this quote. Their point is to question why the consensus is so strong. They suggest that maybe, just maybe, it's because so many biblical scholars work for religious institutions whose very existence and salaries depend on Jesus being a real historical person. It's a pretty direct challenge to the objectivity of the experts in the field.
All right, to really dig in, we have to start where the evidence starts, and that means going to the oldest Christian writings we have, the letters, or the epistles, from the Apostle Paul. These were written decades before the Gospels, so they're our absolute earliest peek into what the first Christians believed.
The mythicist argument really hinges on what we call an argument from silence. They look at Paul's letters, written just 20-some years after Jesus supposedly died, and they point out what's missing. There's nothing about a virgin birth, no stories of miracles, no parables, no trial before Pilate. For mythicists, this silence is just deafening. They argue that Paul is talking about a celestial being, someone crucified by demons in the sky, not a flesh and blood man who walked the roads of Galilee.
But, of course, the mainstream scholars push right back. They say, hold on, look at what Paul does say. He mentions Jesus was born of a woman, that he was a descendant of King David, that he had brothers, including one named James, who Paul says he personally met, and he talks about a Last Supper and a crucifixion. They argue these aren't details about some cosmic space ghost. They firmly anchor Jesus in real human history. And this right here, this one phrase, shows you the whole problem in a nutshell. James, the brother of the Lord. To historicists, that's a slam dunk. It's his literal biological brother and eyewitness. But to mythicists, brother of the Lord is just a spiritual title, like brother in Christ. It doesn't imply any family relationship at all. The exact same evidence leads to two totally opposite conclusions.
Okay, so let's move on from Paul and talk about the Gospels. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the biographical stories most of us think of when we picture Jesus. But for mythicists, these books are Exhibit A for how a myth was later turned into history.
Now this is a fascinating little twist. Mythicists love to point to Jesus' own words from the Gospel of Mark. He basically says he tells stories specifically to confuse people, to hide the truth from outsiders. The mythicists' take? That's the author giving you a giant clue, winking at the reader and saying, hey, this whole book is a parable, it's an allegory, not a history lesson.
And that gets to this really fundamental disagreement. What kind of books are the Gospels? Mythicists say they're fiction, fitting a pattern you see all over the ancient world, the mythic hero. Think of gods like Osiris or Dionysus, who also had stories about divine birth, death, and resurrection. But mainstream scholars say, no, you're misreading them. They classify them as ancient biography, a specific genre that wasn't like modern history. The goal wasn't to be a journalist, it was to preserve someone's memory and promote their teaching.
This timeline is a huge piece of the mythicist argument. They say you can literally watch the story of Jesus evolve over time. If you look at the earliest gospel, Mark, you see a very human prophet who never says he's God. Fast forward 10 or 20 years to Matthew and Luke, and suddenly you get new details like the virgin birth. And by the time John is written, decades later, Jesus is walking around shouting, I am God. For mythicists, this isn't history being recorded, it's a legend being built, layer by layer.
So, if the Christian texts are so debated, what about everybody else? I mean, surely someone outside the movement, like a Roman or Jewish historian, wrote something about this guy who was causing such a stir. Let's take a look.
Well, the first big problem is just the timing. The two best non-Christian sources we have, Josephus and Tacitus, were writing 60 to 80 years after Jesus would have been crucified. Mythicists argue that this is way too late. They say these historians aren't independent witnesses to the events, they're just reporting on what the Christians of their own time believed.
But the most famous and most powerful piece of external evidence comes from the Jewish historian Josephus. In his massive history of the Jewish people, he seems to mention Jesus directly, calling him the Christ and talking about his followers. And at first glance you think, wow, okay, there it is, smoking gun, case closed.
Yeah, but it is not that simple. Not even close. Mythicists argue this entire paragraph is a clumsy forgery, stuck in there by a Christian scribe centuries later. They point out that it interrupts the flow of Josephus's writing and sounds way too much like a Christian declaration of faith. Now, the mainstream view is a little more moderate. Most scholars agree it was probably messed with, but they believe there was an original, authentic core that really did mention a man called Christ. So even our best external evidence is a huge point of contention.
All right, so the texts are tricky. What about physical proof, like something you can actually touch? Well, in 2002, the archaeological world was absolutely stunned by the appearance of this thing, a first-century limestone box for holding bones, known as an ossuary. And this is why it caused such an earthquake. The inscription, carved in Aramaic, reads, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. Now sure, all three were common names back then, but the odds of all three appearing in the correct family order, plus the fact that it was super rare to mention a brother on an ossuary, well, it seemed like this could be the first ever physical evidence for Jesus and his family.
But the story of this box is an absolute roller coaster. At first, it's authenticated. Then, bam, the Israel Antiquities Authority declares part of the inscription a modern fake. The owner gets dragged through a 5-year forgery trial, and in the end, he's actually acquitted because the prosecution couldn't prove its case. So to this day, this amazing piece of potential proof is just stuck in academic limbo.
Okay, so after looking at Paul's letters, the Gospels, the Roman and Jewish historians, and even a controversial bone box, where does all this leave us? Let's try to put it all together.
This table really just lays it all out, doesn't it? For every single category of evidence, there are two completely different ways to interpret it. What one side sees as Paul describing a celestial being, the other sees as a real man with a family. What one sees as allegorical fiction, the other sees as ancient biography. The evidence is the same, but the conclusions are worlds apart.
So here's the real takeaway. While the academic consensus, and it is a very strong consensus, is that a man named Jesus did in fact exist, the Christ myth theory is still incredibly important. It's a powerful reminder of just how difficult it is to piece together the ancient past from sources that are all fragmented, biased, and written with a specific agenda in mind. And that really leaves us with one final, and I think much bigger question. This whole debate isn't just about one figure from history. It's about how we know anything for sure about the ancient world. When all the evidence you have is so thin and can be read in such radically different ways, how do you ever decide what's true? That's a question that makes this whole investigation feel very, very relevant today.